John Perkins on pääekonomisti ja kirjailija. Hän on toiminut pääekonomistina merkittävässä kansainvälisessä konsulttiyrityksessä nimeltä Just T. Main Incorporated. Perkins on neuvonut talousasioissa Maailmanpankkia, YK:ta, kansainvälistä valuuttarahastoa, Yhdysvaltain valtiovarainministeriötä, Fortune 500 yrityksiä sekä lukuisia valtioita ympäri maailmaa. Perkins on työskennellyt suoraan valtionpäämiehien ja suurten yritysten toimitusjohtajien kanssa. Hänen taloutta ja geopolitiikkaa käsitteleviä kirjojaan on myyty yli 1 miljoona kappaletta. Ne ovat olleet kuukausia muun muassa New York Timesin bestseller-listalla ja kirjoja on julkaistu yli 30 kielellä. Perkinsin teos Confessions of an Economic Hitman, mikä suomeksi tarkoittaa taloudellisen ammattitappajan tunnuksia, oli peräti 70 viikkoa New York Timesin bestseller-listalla. Kirja paljastaa hätkähdyttäviä yksityiskohtia kansainvälisestä lahjonnasta, kiristyksestä ja korruptiosta. Hänen toinen teoksensa Secret History of the American Empire, joka myöskin on New York Timesin bestseller, kertoo laittomista operaatioista ja hankkeista, joilla ollaan onnistuttu luomaan maailman ensimmäinen aidosti maailmanlaajuinen imperiumi. Perkinsin kirja Hoodwinked on suunnitelma maailmantalouden uudelleenrakentamisesta. Perkinsin tarjoamat ratkaisut eivät ole tilanteen normalisointia tai paluuta entiseen. Sen sijaan hän haastaa meidät nousemaan tilanteen yläpuolelle, irrottautumaan riistokapitalismista ja siirtymään uuteen aikakauteen tavalla, joka on muutosvoimaisempi kuin maatalous- ja teollisuusvallankumous aikanaan. Hänen kirjoituksensa käsittelee toimia ja askeleita, joita jokainen meistä voi ottaa ja ryhtyä osaltaan luomaan kestävää ja rauhanomaisempaa maailmaa. Perkins on perustaja ja hallituksen jäsen epäkaupallisissa Dream Change ja Pachamama Alliance-järjestöissä, joiden tarkoituksena on luoda maailma, jonka lapsemme haluaisivat periä. Perkins on luennoinut yli 50 yliopistossa ympäri maailmaa ja hän on kirjoittanut kirjoja muun muassa alkuperäiskulttuureista ja niiden muuttumisesta. Hän on ollut esillä lukuisilla mediafoorumeilla, suurimmilla ulkomaisilla TV-kanavilla sekä sanomalehdissä. Esiintynyt useissa dokumenttielokuvissa ja hänen artikkeleitaan on julkaistu lukemattomissa lehdissä. Myyntimenestyksestään huolimatta Perkinsin saavutukset eivät ole saaneet laajempaa huomiota valtamediassa. Siirrymme nyt seuraamaan Perkinsin haastattelua vuodelta 2008.
We economic hitmen really have been the ones responsible for creating this first truly global empire. And we work many different ways. But perhaps the most common is that we will identify a country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, and then arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. But the money never actually goes to the country. Instead, it goes to our big corporations to build infrastructure projects in that country, power plants, industrial parks, ports, things that benefit a few rich people in that country, in addition to our corporations, but really don't help the majority of the people at all. However, those people, the whole country is left holding a huge debt. It's such a big debt they can't repay it, and that's part of the plan. that they can't repay it. And so at some point we economic hitmen go back to them and say, listen, you owe us a lot of money, can't pay your debts, so sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies. Allow us to build a military base in your country, or send troops in support of ours to someplace in the world like Iraq, or vote with us on the next UN vote. To have their electric utility company privatized and their water and sewage system privatized and sold to U.S. corporations or other multinational corporations. So there was that whole mushrooming thing, and it's so typical of the way the IMF and the World Bank work, that you put a country in debt, it's such a big debt it can't pay it, and then you offer to refinance that debt and pay even more interest. And you demand this quid pro quo, which you call a conditionality or good governance, which means basically that they've got to sell off their resources, including many of their social services, their utility companies, their school systems sometimes, their penal systems, their insurance systems, to foreign corporations. So it's a double, triple, quadruple whammy. The precedent for economic hitmen really began back in the early 50s when democratically elected Mossadegh, who was elected in Iran, he was considered to be the hope for democracy in the Middle East and around the world. He was Time Magazine's Man of the Year. But one of the things that he'd run on and began to implement was the idea that foreign oil companies needed to pay the Iranian people a lot more for the oil that they were taking out of Iran. The Iranian people should benefit from their own oil. Strange policy. We didn't like that, of course. But we were afraid to do what we normally were doing, which was to send in the military. Instead, we sent in one CIA agent, Kermit Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's relative. And Kermit went in with a few $1 million and was very, very effective and efficient. And in a short amount of time, he managed to get Mossadegh overthrown and brought in the Shah of Iran to replace him, who always was favorable to oil. And it was extremely effective.
Mobs overflow Tehran. Army officers shout that Mossadegh has surrendered and his regime as virtual dictator of Iran is ended. Pictures of the Shah are paraded through the streets as sentiment reverses. The Shah is welcomed home.
So back here in the United States, in Washington, people looked around and said, wow, that was easy and cheap. So this established a whole new way of manipulating countries, of creating empire. The only problem with Roosevelt was that he was a card-carrying CIA agent, and had he been caught, the ramifications could have been pretty serious. So very quickly at that point, the decision was made to use private consultants to channel the money through the World Bank or the IMF or one of the other such agencies, to bring in people like me who worked for private companies, so that if we got caught, there would be no governmental ramifications. When Arbenz became president of Guatemala, the country was very much under the thumbs of United Fruit Company, the big international corporations. And Arbenz ran on this ticket that says, you know, we want to get the land back to the people. And once he took power, he was implementing policies that would do exactly that, give the land rights back to the people. United Fruit didn't like that very much. And so they hired a public relations firm, launched a huge campaign in the United States to convince the United States people, the citizens of the United States, and the press of the United States, and the Congress of the United States, that Arbenz was a Soviet puppet, and that if we allowed him to stay in power, the Soviets would have a foothold in this hemisphere. And that at that point in time was a huge fear on everybody's mind, the Red Terror, the Communist terror. And so, to make a long story short, out of this public relations campaign came a commitment on the part of the CIA and the military to take this man out. And in fact, we did. We sent in planes, we sent in soldiers, we sent in jackals, we sent everything in to take him out, and did take him out. And as soon as he was removed from office, the new guy that took over after him basically reinstated everything to the big international corporations, including United Fruit. Ecuador for many, many years had been ruled by pro-US dictators, often relatively brutal. Then it was decided that they were going to have a truly democratic election. Jaime Roldos ran for office, and his main goal, he said, as president would be to make sure that Ecuador's resources were used to help the people. And he won, overwhelming by more votes than anybody had ever won anything in Ecuador. And he began to implement these policies to make sure that the profits from oil went to help the people. Well, we didn't like that in the United States. I was sent down as one of several economic hitmen to change Roldos, to corrupt him, to bring him around, to let him know, okay, you can get very rich, you and your family, if you play our game, but if you continue to try to keep these policies you've promised, you're going to go. He wouldn't listen. He was assassinated. As soon as the plane crashed, the whole area was cordoned off. The only people allowed in were U.S. military from a nearby base and some of the Ecuadorian military. When an investigation was launched, 2 of the key witnesses died in car accidents before they had a chance to testify. A lot of very, very strange things that went on around the assassination of Jaime Roldos. I, like most people who've really looked at this case, have absolutely no doubt that it was an assassination. And of course, in my position as an economic hitman, I was always expecting something to happen to Jaime, whether it be a coup or assassination, I wasn't sure, but that he would be taken down because he was not being corrupted. He would not allow himself to be corrupted the way we wanted to corrupt him. Omar Torrijos, president of Panama, was, one of my favorite people. I really, really liked him. He was very charismatic. He was a guy who really wanted to help his country. And when I tried to bribe him or corrupt him, he said, look, John, he called me Juanito. He said, look, Juanito, I don't need the money. What I really need is for my country to be treated fairly. I need for the United States to repay the debts that you owe my people for all the destruction you've done here. I need to be in a position where I can help other Latin American countries win their independence and be free of this terrible presence from the north that you people are exploiting us so badly. I need to have the Panama Canal back in the hands of the Panamanian people. That's what I want. And so, leave me alone. Don't try to bribe me. It was 1981, and in May, Jaime Roldos was assassinated. And Omar was very aware of this. Torrijos got his family together and he said, I'm probably next, but it's okay because I've done what I came here to do. I've renegotiated the canal. The canal will now be in our hands. He just finished negotiating the treaty with Jimmy Carter. In June of that same year, just a couple of months later, he also went down in an airplane crash, which there's no question was executed by CIA-sponsored jackals. Tremendous amount of evidence that one of Torrijos' security guards handed him at the last moment as he was getting on the plane a tape recorder, a small tape recorder that contained a bomb. It is interesting to me how this system has continued pretty much the same way for years and years and years, except the economic hitmen have got better and better and better. Then we come up with, very recently, what happened in Venezuela. In 1998, Hugo Chavez gets elected president, following a long line of presidents who had been very corrupt and basically destroyed the economy of the country. And Chavez was elected amidst all that. Chavez stood up to the United States, and he's done it primarily demanding that Venezuelan oil be used to help the Venezuelan people. Well, we didn't like that in the United States. So in 2002, a coup was staged, which there's no question in my mind and most other people's minds that the CIA was behind that coup. The way that coup was fomented was very reflective of what Kermit Roosevelt had done in Iran, of paying people to go out into the streets to riot, to protest, to say this Chavez is very unpopular. If you can get a few thousand people to do that in television, and can make it look like it's the whole country, and things start to mushroom. Except in the case of Chavez, he was smart enough, and the people were so strongly behind him that they overcame it, which was a phenomenal moment in the history of Latin America. Iraq actually is a perfect example of the way the whole system works. So we economic hitmen are the first line of defense. We go in and we try to corrupt governments. and get them to accept these huge loans, which we then use as leverage to basically own them. If we fail, as I failed in Panama with Omar Torrijos and in Ecuador with Jaime Roldos, men who refuse to be corrupted, then the second line of defense is we send in the jackals. And the jackals either overthrow governments or they assassinate. And once that happens and a new government comes in, and boy, it's going to toe the line because the new president knows what will happen if he doesn't. In the case of Iraq, both of those things failed. Economic hitmen were not able to get through to Saddam Hussein. We tried very hard. We tried to get him to accept a deal very similar to what the House of Saud had accepted in Saudi Arabia, but he wouldn't accept it. And so the jackals went in to take him out. They couldn't do it. His security was very good. After all, he had one time worked for the CIA. He'd been hired to assassinate a former president of Iraq and failed, but he knew the system. So in '91, we send in the troops and we take out the Iraqi military. So we assume at that point that Saddam Hussein is going to come around. We could have taken him out, of course, at that time, but we didn't want to. He's the kind of strong man we like. He controls his people. We thought he could control the Kurds and keep the Iranians in their border and keep pumping oil for us. And that once we took out his military, now he's going to come around. So the economic hitmen go back in the 90s without success. If they'd had success, he'd still be running the country. We'd be selling him all the fighter jets he wants and everything else he wants. But they couldn't, they didn't have success. The jackals couldn't take him out again, so we sent the military in once again, and this time we did the complete job and took him out, and in the process created for ourselves some very, very lucrative construction deals. We had to reconstruct a country that we'd essentially destroyed, which is a pretty good deal if you own construction companies, big ones. So, Iraq shows the three stages. The economic hitmen failed there, the jackals failed there, and as a final measure, the military goes in. And in that way, we've really created an empire, but we've done it very, very subtly. It's clandestine. All the empires of the past were built on the military, and everybody knew they were building them. So the British knew they were building them, the French, the Germans, the Romans, the Greeks. And they were proud of it, and they always had some excuse like spreading civilization, spreading some religion, something like that. But they knew they were doing it. We don't. The majority of the people in the United States have no idea that we're living off the benefits of a clandestine empire, that today there's more slavery in the world than ever before. And then you have to ask yourself, well, if it's an empire, then who's the emperor? Obviously, our presidents of the United States are not emperors. An emperor is someone who's not elected, doesn't serve a limited term, and doesn't report to anyone, essentially. So you can't classify our presidents that way. But we do have what I consider to be the equivalent of the emperor, and it's what I call the corporatocracy. The corporatocracy is this group of individuals who run our biggest corporations, and they really act as the emperor of this empire. They control our media, either through direct ownership or advertising. They control most of our politicians because they finance their campaigns, either through their corporations or through personal contributions that come out of the corporations. They're not elected, they don't serve a limited term, they don't report to anybody. And at the very top of the corporatocracy, you really can't tell whether a person's working for a private corporation or the government because they're always moving back and forth. So, you've got a guy who one moment is the president of a big construction company like Halliburton, and the next moment he's vice president of the United States, or the president who was in the oil business. And this is true whether you've got Democrats or Republicans in the office. You have them moving back and forth through the revolving door. And in a way, our government is invisible a lot of the time, and its policies are carried out by our corporations on one level or another. And then again, the policies of the government are basically forged by the corporatocracy and then presented to the government. They become government policy. So it's an incredibly cozy relationship. This isn't a conspiracy theory type of thing. These people don't have to get together and plot to do things. They all basically work under one primary assumption, and that is that they must maximize profits regardless of the social and environmental costs.
Seuraava haastattelu on tehty 20. toukokuuta 2011 koskien Suomen ja Euroopan tilannetta. Vaikuttaa siltä, että taloudelliset ammattitappajat ovat siirtyneet kolmannen maailman maista vauraisiin länsimaihin.
John Perkins, in your opinion, were Greek and Portugal that our government is trying to save being hit by an economic hitman?
Yes, I have no doubt, but what many countries in Europe have been hit by economic hitmen. Greece, Portugal, it started in Iceland actually, and moved into Greece, Ireland, Portugal, to a certain degree Spain. It's typical when these bankers, these economic hitmen really go in and convince countries, their banks and individuals to take on huge amounts of debt. And then when the economy fails, they can't pay off the debt. The countries are verging on bankruptcy, as Greece is right now, as Iceland did several years ago. And at that point, demands are made on these countries by the stronger countries and by the stronger central banking systems. So pretty much puts these countries in a subservient position. It's a very, it's exactly the kind of thing I talk about and that I did as an economic hitman in what we call the third world countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East.
I see. Greek called professionals to aid them with their privatization. So is this exactly what you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, I always think privatization is a huge mistake. When countries essentially sell their most basic resources, their electricity, their water, their sewer systems, this thing to private companies, that's a huge mistake, but it's a very common technique that's used by economic hitmen. We did this time and time again in the developing world, and our private corporations ended up owning what used to be public sector businesses and now privately owned. And every time that happens, people suffer, especially the poorer people in any of these countries.
How about the European financial crisis in general? For example, the stabilization mechanisms. Would you think there is something else to the official story that we have not been told?
Well, it's all speculation on my part. I haven't worked in Europe for a very long time, and I don't have any inside information. But it seems to me that some of the stronger countries, particularly like Germany and perhaps France and a few of the others, are really aligning themselves to create some sort of a super European Union within the European Union, if you will. So the strong countries have more control. It's a form of empire building, and it also is playing into the hands of big corporations, of course.
The Finnish national debt is running wild, and our government just keeps loaning more, like in Greece, Spain and Ireland, like you said. Could also the Finnish government be hit by an economic hitman?
I certainly suspect that is happening. It's been a successful policy from the standpoint of the economic hitmen in places like Iceland and Ireland and Greece, and so why not try it at other places? If it would be the typical approach for economic hitmen to keep expanding that process.
Yes. You stated in one of your earlier commentaries that they use debt to build military bases. Would you think they could also expand NATO through debt?
Oh, absolutely. Because when a country's in debt and it's approaching bankruptcy, if it's in a financial crisis and it can't pay off your debt, the strong countries can make huge demands. They can demand almost anything they want. And this is definitely what we're seeing now throughout all of these countries, that in order to restructure the debt, big demands are being made. For example, in Greece right now, they're talking about extending the debt. So some debt that might have been due a year from now is going to be extended for 10 years, but there'll be a big price to pay for that. And that is what we call conditionalities. And often those conditionalities require countries allowing others to build military bases on their land, join organizations like NATO, privatize their public utility sectors, things like that, demands like that. I mean, there's always a quid pro quo. So if you extend debt, if you give a favor, if you're a strong country and you grant a favor to a financially weaker country, you're going to demand concessions. That's the way the game's played, unfortunately.
In your opinion, Are there any advices that you would give to our politicians? How should they counter this economic attack?
Well, I suspect your politicians don't have a lot of choices, and that's typical today, that politicians really do not have a lot of power in the world today. That includes the United States president. I can speak personally from that standpoint, that presidents and other politicians these days are extremely vulnerable. And I mean, we've just seen the head of the IMF go down because he's been accused of sexual misconduct. Now, I'm not defending him at all, and I certainly don't like the IMF very much, so I'm no great fan of this man. But and I don't know whether he committed these crimes or not. But what I do know is that all you need is to accuse someone of such crimes, and it can destroy them politically. And every political leader, whether it's in Finland or the United States, knows this. And so your political leaders in Finland know that they're very vulnerable to all kinds of pressures. And so it really is up to the people to take a stand. The people of Finland need to take a stand and refuse to agree to some of these conditionalities. Refuse to have your public sector businesses like utility companies and water and sewage companies, refuse to have them privatized. Keep them in your own hands. Refuse to allow military bases or whatever the conditions are. Just don't meet them. Refuse.
So we can just refuse. What kind of ramifications would that have?
Well, Iceland has refused. Argentina has refused. Ecuador has refused. And in most cases, they do better when they refuse. It's hard to know exactly what leverage would be imposed, and part of that depends on how well your political leaders do stand up to it. But I think the important thing is to get the message out there that you're not going to be bullied. And it's also important to form alliances. So my strong recommendation, and I was in Iceland not too long ago, to the people there, I go to Ecuador, my strong recommendation there is, don't pay these debts. You don't really owe these debts. The people don't owe them. These were debts that were taken on by politicians, and they made a lot of money, but the rest of the people didn't. Refuse to pay them, but also form alliances with other countries. So if a country like Finland forms alliances with Iceland and Spain, and maybe Latin American countries, maybe African countries, if all the countries that have debt outstanding that's going to be hard for them to pay, form alliances and say, listen, this debt is unfair and the interest rates are too high. Something has to be done to make this a more level playing field. If you all come together to do that, it's going to be very, very difficult for the IMF, the World Bank, or the United States, or the Germany, or any of the other big central banking countries to force you to do something that you don't want to do.
What about the monetary system itself? You talked about this in your new book. Should we try to fix the current monetary system, or drop it, or try something else? Do you see any alternatives to this debt-based banking system?
Oh, it's a terrible system for us, the people. It's a great system for the corporatocracy, the people who have all the power and the money. Gives them total control. So, yeah, definitely we need to come up with a new system. But obviously the status quo, the powers that be, are going to dig in and try to stop that. I think that's probably the reason why we've attacked, and by we I mean the United States, NATO, the G8 countries have attacked Libya. Muammar Gaddafi was acting very strongly in terms of trying to organize African countries and Muslim countries to move out of the dollar as their standard currency to accept something he called the gold dinar, and use that to demand that they be paid in dinars, gold dinars, for oil rather than US dollars. And also, Gaddafi had his own kind of central banking system that owned a tremendous amount of gold. He was looking at reorganizing that. And we know that the rebels in Libya, what we call the rebels, the ones who oppose Gaddafi, have already proposed their own central banking system, which is very similar to the ones used in Europe and the one used by the Federal Reserve in the United States. So the United States and the European countries want to get rid of Gaddafi and bring in this new regime that will have a banking system that's more acceptable to our way of thinking, that really favors big corporations. And all of us need to recognize that that's all it's about, favoring big corporations, giving the corporatocracy more power.
I know that you would like me to ask this question in a world perspective, but is there something that you would like to say to the Finnish people? What can every one of us do to make a true change happen?
I think the important thing for people to recognize around the world today is that we're in a time when things have changed. Governments no longer have the power. Big corporations have the power. And in many respects, the people of Finland are in the same boat as the people from the United States, from Greece, from Iceland, from Libya, for that matter. We're all kind of in this boat together, and we call it the Earth. But for the first time, we're really united. It's a very integrated, interrelated planet economically. And it's controlled by the corporatocracy, the people who run our biggest corporations. It's no longer governments. It used to be that you could look at the planet as this globe with roughly 200 countries, of which a few had a lot of power: the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, the United States, different times. But today, you'd really better look at the globe from a geopolitical standpoint as having huge clouds drifting around it. These are the big corporations. They cover the entire planet. They don't know national boundaries. And we need to understand that. But these corporations are dependent on us, the people of Finland, the people of the United States, the people of the world, to provide their labor and provide their markets, to buy their goods and services. So our power rests in standing up to the corporations and letting them know that we're no longer going to accept the driving principle that they have been listening to since the 1970s. And that's when everything changed, when a new form of economics, what I call predatory capitalism, really took hold. And the driving principle of that is maximize profits regardless of the social and environmental costs. We, the people, need to insist that these big corporations accept a new guiding principle. And that could be, make a decent rate of return for your investors, but only within the context of creating a world our children will want to inherit. Only within the context of creating a sustainable world, a just world, a peaceful world, a world where people across the planet can thrive. So let's focus on that. But it has to come from us, we the people, the consumers, the workers, the ones who contribute to the corporations. It's not going to come from our leaders because they're essentially puppets of the corporations.
So, what about resources? It seems this is all about resources. Would you think that one of the answers would be starting to produce some of the resources locally that we are dependent on importing at the moment?
Well, local production is extremely important always. I'm all for these local movements to buy food, to buy everything that you possibly can locally. That's a very good thing. On the other hand, we have to be realistic and recognize that we live on a very tiny planet right now. For the first time in history, we're all really interconnected. I mean, you and I are having this conversation across the Atlantic Ocean simultaneously. You're seeing me. And this is happening all over the world. We are incredibly interconnected. We're not doing this locally. I'm not sitting there in your office. You're not sitting in my office. So the planet has become localized in many respects from a communication and transportation standpoint. We need to recognize that. And that is why the big corporations, the multinationals, are becoming so powerful, because they're no longer restricted to being local. Back in the time of the Medici, things were very localized, and each city in Europe was its own city-state. And then we got nations, and then we get unions like the European Union. But today, what we've really got is the big corporations, and they're global, and we need to recognize that. So yeah, buy local, do as much as you can locally, but also recognize that we have to impact these huge corporations that are calling the shots around the world, because they're going to continue to do that. We're going to have these same systems in place unless there's a huge crisis that just wipes out everything.
What about the European Union? Would you think it's working for the people or for the corporatocracy, since it seems that divide and conquer is the motto?
It's to the advantage of the big corporations to divide and conquer. So the European Union, for example, is a great idea from a standpoint of citizens, from a standpoint of coming together in the same way that city-states came together to form nations, bring nations together to form unions. But the corporations don't like that. The corporations would rather have Greece dependent on them rather than combined with a powerful union in Europe. because then the corporations can go in and take whatever resources they want from Greece or to dominate the Greek marketplace. The same with Finland, the same with Iceland. So the more divided people are, the better it is for the rulers. And today the rulers are what I call the corporatocracy, the men, primarily men, who run our biggest corporations. So they really don't like to see these unions. But this is the time for us, we the people, the consumers, to come together and say, hey, you know, we want a better world. And we're only going to buy from corporations that are committed to creating a sustainable, just, peaceful world, and a world that's thriving for everybody on the planet. It's time that I really recognize that my 3.5-year-old grandson can't hope to inherit a world he will really want to live in unless every child growing up in Finland, in Botswana, in Bolivia, in Indonesia, in Israel and Palestine has that same world. This is brand new. Used to be that all we really needed to worry about was taking care of Finland, taking care of the United States, taking care of, you know, our local areas. But today we have to understand that the whole world is our home. It's not just a country anymore. And we have to realize, for example, in the United States, where we talk about homeland security all the time, we can't possibly have homeland security until we understand that the whole world is our homeland. So it is up to we, the people, to come together. We've really moved from a time in history not so long ago when religious organizations called the shots to one after that where governments call the shots. And now we've moved into a period where the corporations call the shots. So you have to ask yourself, what's next? What's beyond the corporations? And the answer is we, the people. And because the corporations are not controlling us militarily, we have a tremendous advantage here. They depend on us to buy their goods and services and to man their offices, to run them, to be part of them, to work in them. And so we have a great deal of power, and we, the people, have to recognize that we have that power, and then we have to take actions that will exhibit that power and force the corporations to create a better world for us.
Okay. Do you have anything to say to the consumers, for example, the Finnish consumers that are buying t-shirts for €1, knowing that they have been made by slaves in the third world countries?
Yeah, that's the big problem. You know, we the consumer have sent a very strong message. Well, we want cheap shirts, you know, and if they happen to be made by slaves in sweatshops in Indonesia or China or someplace, we'll just look the other way. And we want cheap petroleum for our cars, and if that happens to mean destroying rainforests in the Amazon, we'll just look the other way. And we can't send that message anymore. We have to send a message that says we want a good world for every child on this planet, and recognize that no child growing up in Finland is going to have that good world unless those kids growing up in Indonesia and China are also going to have that world. This is a fact of life today. We have to understand it. It's going to become a stronger and stronger fact in the future. We are globalized, and so we have to insist that every worker who makes every shirt and every resource, whether it's oil in the Amazon or whatever it is, has to be brought to us as the consumer with tremendous integrity, that the workers all have to receive good pay, good living conditions, health care, and old age insurance, and that the resources are protected, the environment is protected. We, the consumer, have to insist on that.
Okay, thank you to John Perkins for this amazing interview. You truly show incredible courage when you're giving out all these statements throughout the internet and television around the world.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you for doing what you do. Keep up your good work.
And to you too. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.